think it's important to understand that Joseph Smith was very, very fortunate to have surrounded himself with some very extremely capable, highly intelligent, deeply spiritual men and women, but none more than Oliver Cowdery. And I think it's time that people understand that I think there's this misconception of Oliver Cowdery in the church, particularly in the church, that Oliver left the church. Hence, he is a man of weakness, and we can kind of discard his early experiences in association with Joseph Smith. But that is a wrong thing to do. That is a wrong assumption, and Oliver Cowdery needs to receive a lot of credit for the role he played in the early events of the Restoration. And I argue that between his coming on the scene, so to speak, in April of 1829 until his excommunication in 1838, there's no one who contributes more to the kingdom of God than Oliver Cowdery. And it's high time he received that recognition. True, he had some personal differences, but he never wavered in his belief of Joseph Smith. And I think Joseph Smith could say with great confidence he could not have done what he did without the help of Oliver Cowdery. There's a reason he is called the second elder. He is the number 2 man in the early kingdom, and rightfully so. Oliver Cowdery was born in Wells, Rutland County, Vermont, on October 3rd, 1806. He was 10 months younger than Joseph Smith. And if you wanted to measure by the way the crow flies, they're not that far apart. The Smith family, of course, is up in Sharon, South Royalton area, and Oliver and his family, his parents and family, are, as I mentioned, in Wells, maybe a distance of about 75 miles by road, but maybe only about 50 miles by direct line. So they're very close in terms of their proximity to each other. And not surprising, Oliver's just up the road from Brigham Young family. So Vermont has produced some wonderful early members of the Restoration, early leaders, early figures. Principal of which, no question, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and Brigham Young. Oliver is the son of William and Rebecca Fuller Cowdery. William and Rebecca had 8 children. Oliver was the youngest of those 8. Sadly, in the Cowdery family, Oliver's mother, Rebecca Fuller, died in 1809 from tuberculosis. Of course, very few people survived that kind of illness, leaving William Cowdery with these 8 children. Some of them had grown, were mature, but he still had young children, necessitating, of course, a remarriage. And in 1810, so just a few months later, William married a woman by the name of Keziah Pierce Austin, and she had one son from a previous marriage named Silas. And between William and his new wife, Keziah, they had 3 more children. So this brought the Cowdery household to a total of 12. And again, some of these had grown and left the home, but what I'm saying is William has a second family by this second wife. So Oliver would have been very close to these younger children, him being the youngest of the first marriage. There's also an interesting connection to the Cowdery family, and that is Oliver's half-sister, Lucy, born to Keziah and William. She was born in 1814. She later marries Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother. So there's a connection to the Cowdery family, a strong connection, of course, through marriage of the Cowdery family and, of course, Brigham Young's family, or particularly his brother Phineas. But that is a major, major important component in Oliver's life story, because it's Phineas Young who's going to be the major player in encouraging and really negotiating and facilitating Oliver Cowdery's return to the church in 1848. I think it's important to also note that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were distant cousins. A very famous ancestor of Joseph Smith is a man by the name of John Lothrop, or John Lathrop, sometimes referred to in that name. And a very, very famous and influential congregational preacher in Barnstable, Massachusetts. And among his children and descendants, he actually had a daughter named Jane Lothrop Fuller, and she is the ancestor to Rebecca Fuller, Oliver's mother, direct line ancestor to Jane Lothrop. Well, Joseph Smith is also a descendant of John Lothrop through another line, but I think it's interesting that we could chart it out, but it's a distant relationship, but Oliver is related to Joseph Smith multi-generationally there. It's also interesting that Oliver Cowdery also ties into the Pratt brothers and also Wilford Woodruff. So we have an extended family connection here between some of the early and most prominent leaders of early Mormonism. We don't know too many facts related to Oliver's early life, his boyhood, young manhood, and so on. We know the family is moving around the Vermont area. There's also evidence they did move to western New York for a short time, not too far from Palmyra. But they do end up coming back to the Vermont area. And it's probably around 1826 or 1827 that Oliver makes his move to the region of western upstate New York. He has some family members already there, and obviously were drawn probably by their presence there to come and seek some opportunities for employment, and so he came there probably again no later than 1827. It looks like Oliver, when he moved to New York, lived in Arcadia, which is Newark, New York, or possibly Lyons, New York. So he's within a good striking distance, just a few miles east of Palmyra. So he's in that area, again, around 1826-27, no later than 27. I wish we knew more about Oliver's upbringing, but we know that he received a fairly good education. And in fact, Vermont was noted for its fine educational system and its beginning schools, or traditional schools. So Oliver probably had some pretty good educational background and training, at least in the basics, and so he could serve, no question, in numerous capacities, and we could consider him at least not highly educated, but educated by the standards of the day, and particularly the standards of the Vermont system. The connection with the Smith family is very, very important in connection with Oliver Cowdery. In fall of 1828, Oliver's brother Lyman Cowdery is in the Palmyra area, and he receives an appointment to teach school in the Palmyra, Manchester area. And for some reason, Lyman backs out. Now, it's quite interesting. Hiram Smith, at this point in time, is on the school board for this Manchester District School 11, number 11. And with Lyman's urging, he urges the school board to select his brother, his younger brother, Oliver, believing he could do an important and make a good contribution as a school teacher. So the board accepts that, and Oliver is contracted to teach in the Manchester Schoolhouse, District 11 schoolhouse. What's interesting is he's single, And so we can probably assume that part of that contract meant that he would seek boarding in the homes of the students from whom he was selected to teach. Records show that there was 107 students enrolled in this school. Now, they would not all attend on the same day, and we're not sure how they negotiated that number of students. But it is interesting that Joseph's younger siblings would have participated in that school taught by Oliver Cowdery, including Catherine, Don Carlos, and little Lucy. So we know again that Oliver is going to have some connections with the family, or begins his connections with the Smith family through his appointment as the teacher in this school where the Smith children are attending. The school year, I'm sure many young people would appreciate this today or would desire this, but it basically went from the end of October to about April 1st, so about 5 months, obviously allowing for some harvest opportunities and things necessary in the fall, and then of course necessitating the school close in the early spring. So it was only a 5-month contract. Oliver was scheduled to teach that contract year and was guaranteed a payment of $65.50 upon completion of the school year. So he wasn't paid monthly. He had to finish out the term to be able to receive his employment. Oliver, of course, becomes familiar with the Smith family, and we're not sure exactly when, but he also became familiar with David Whitmer. It looks like in possibly November of 1828, David Whitmer comes up from Fayette to Palmyra to do some business. Palmyra is, of course, on the Erie Canal. It's an economic center for kind of a lot of the region there. And it looks like, from what we can understand, that Oliver somehow made a connection with David Whitmer, again, November of 1828. By this time, of course, Oliver has probably heard about the discussions and hearsay about the Joseph Smith and this Golden Bible. And it looks like David Whitmer also became kind of curious about it. They probably had discussions about it. And with Oliver's association with the family, of course, that would have come up in their talks and so on. We think probably David asked questions to Oliver, again, began to probe, well, what is this all about? So we think that this is probably how we're going to make the connection with the Whitmer family down in Fayette through David Whitmer, who will become a friend of Oliver during this period of winter of 1828. During this time he was boarding with the Smiths. He would have received plenty of opportunities, had plenty of opportunities to talk with the family. We don't know how open they were with him and this kind of thing, but certainly he learned some things associated with their son, Joseph Smith, and who's now living at this point in time, of course, in Harmony, Pennsylvania, down on the Susquehanna near Emma Hale's Smith's family. So, but nonetheless, he does learn about this marvelous young son of theirs and some of his religious claims. Oliver's clearly interested, and he's sparked, he's curious, wants to know what maybe he could do to actually meet Joseph Smith and to possibly make some connections regarding some of his claims. So at the ending of the school year, which would have been around April 1, Oliver makes an attempt, and of course does go down now, to visit Joseph Smith and to see for himself and to talk with him about his religious claims and experiences. And Samuel Smith goes with him to take him down to that down to the Harmony area. Not surprising then, en route, Oliver will stop over at the Whitmer home and visit with David Whitmer and tell him and inform him about Joseph Smith and what he's learned, and of course indicates to him that of course there was some arrangements made, obviously, that they would communicate what was going on when Oliver's down there, what he finds out. And so we're starting to see the connections now made to the early families and early individuals of the Restoration through Oliver Cowdery. I think it's very, very important we understand that the Lord was preparing other individuals to assist in the Restoration. And again, Oliver Cowdery is going to be the main right-hand person for Joseph Smith. And to do that, he gave them some of these individuals some marvelous spiritual experiences in preparation for their role. While the Smith family clearly told Oliver about some of their son's experiences and connections with the gold plates, Oliver himself had his own personal witness, if we could say it that way, regarding the plates and Joseph Smith. In 1832, when Joseph Smith was writing his history, he inserted this text, this narrative regarding Oliver Cowdery's conversion, or at least his initial prompting to come down and visit him in Harmony. And here's what Joseph Smith wrote. The Lord appeared unto a young man by the name of Oliver Cowdery, and shewed unto him the plates in a vision, and also the truth of the work, and what the Lord was about to do through me, his unworthy servant. Therefore he was desirous to come and write for me, to translate. And my wife had written some for me to translate, and also my brother Samuel H. Smith. But we had become reduced in property, and my wife's father was about to turn me out of doors. I had not where to go, and I cried unto the Lord that he would provide for me to accomplish the work whereunto he had commanded me. The significant part of that is that Oliver had had his own kind of personal manifestation or vision. I think the Lord had shown unto him, Joseph Smith's statement clearly says Joseph Smith had had some sort of a vision in which he recognized Joseph Smith had received some plates. Now the plates are obviously in Harmony, but he had had some sort of mind vision communicated to him by God to know that this young man's claims were true. And hence an added desire, if not the main reason, Oliver's now going down to Harmony. He's not going down just for idle curiosity, although that was probably the case initially. He was thinking, hey, when this is over, when I'm done with the school year, I'll go down there. But now he has some spiritual reassurance. This is legitimate, and Joseph Smith needs your help. And Joseph clearly, of course, later saw Oliver Cowdery's coming as a divine providence, as someone who the Lord had prepared to help him in the course of the translation of the Book of Mormon, especially since Martin Harris had failed to keep his agreement regarding the translation in the lost 116 pages. Oliver Cowdery, accompanied by Samuel Smith, left Palmyra on March 31st, 1829, and made their way to Harmony. Again, as I have mentioned, stopping at the Whitmer home in Fayette, about 25-30 miles from Palmyra. And while there, he, of course, communicated to David Whitmer and the entire Whitmer family, I'm sure, what his intentions were on going down to Harmony and investigating and seeing if he cannot possibly help out this Joseph Smith, who he's never met. I think it's significant that the Whitmer family is, of course, going to be very much connected to Oliver Cowdery. Their youngest daughter, Elizabeth Ann, at this time is only 14 years of age, but this is who Oliver will marry. He'll wait until 1832. She'll be 17 years of age at that time, but Oliver is going to become a Whitmer in-law upon the marriage of him and Elizabeth Ann in 1832. So again, you can't separate the early experiences of Oliver Cowdery without including the Whitmer family, and significantly this family will play a major role in his life, have a major impact in Oliver's life, especially following their marriage his marriage to Elizabeth Ann in 1832. After leaving the Whitmer home, there is also some evidence that Samuel may have taken Oliver and temporarily laid over also in Colesville with the Joseph Knight Sr. family. Samuel would have been probably familiar with them, and earlier Joseph Smith Sr. had visited, had come down to Harmony, and he had stayed over with the Knight family as well, him and Lucy. So there's some evidence that, or possibility that Oliver and Samuel are also going to make connections with the Knight family in Colesville while Oliver's en route to visit Joseph Smith in early April of 1829. I'm sure it was a surprise to Joseph Smith, at least it's indicated by his narrative history here, that Oliver shows up. And he mentions or at least in the manuscript history of Joseph Smith, he records this, or this is recorded. On the 5th day of April, 1829, Oliver Cowdery came to my house, again this is in Harmony, Pennsylvania, until which time I had never seen him. He stated to me that he had been teaching school in the neighborhood where my father resided, and my father being one of those who sent to the school, he went to board for a season at his house, and while there the family related to him the circumstances of my having received the plates. And accordingly he had come to make inquiries of me. 2 days after the arrival of Mr. Cowdery, being the 7th of April, I commenced to translate the Book of Mormon, and he began to write for me. So Oliver's conversion to Joseph Smith's spiritual experience was rather quick. I can imagine they conversed at length for those 2 or so days, 2-3 days, and Oliver was quickly convinced. This young man is genuine, his claims are real, I want to help him, I feel I need to be a part of this translation and helping this young man bring forth this sacred record. So Joseph and Oliver begin the translation process together on, as he indicated from his history, on April 7th. And Oliver is an excellent scribe. He has good handwriting. I think he has good command of the English language, good spelling abilities. Not perfect because they're still spelling a lot of things phonetically, but Oliver's the right guy for this type of activity, and they move along. And this, unlike the translation with Martin Harris, which took a considerable amount of more time, they move along in this translation much more quickly than the previous attempt with Martin Harris. Probably like anyone, Oliver enjoys, and probably, of course, it's a little bit laborious, but as he's writing, he, of course, does the best he can to take down the voice narration of Joseph Smith. But it looks like probably around the latter part of April, he's kind of tired of being the scribe, and basically says, "Hey Joseph, why don't we switch places? Could I do this? And you be the scribe, I'll be the translator." And Joseph receives a revelation. It's now D&C section 6, and basically the Lord says in there, Oliver has a gift. We'll give him an opportunity to translate as well. And 3 revelations really tie into this experience. Section 6 of the Doctrine and Covenants is the permission to go ahead and be able to translate this record. Section 8 tells him how to do it. Basically, you have to connect up with your mind and heart, and the revelation will be received in that kind of, through those faculties. And then Section 9 tells him why he wasn't ultimately successful. So I can see why Joseph would say, "Hey, let's maybe give Oliver a shot at this." And what's interesting in the translation process, some have kind of been a little critical of Joseph and Oliver in this, because Oliver ultimately really didn't do very well, and said he did not continue as he commenced, and he feared. I think Oliver realized real quickly this is not, it doesn't come just by osmosis. It takes a real mental approach, as well as spiritual, obviously, to try to decipher these characters and their meaning. And but the Lord says, I'm not displeased with you. So let's just probably go back to the original arrangement. Joseph translator, Oliver scribe. We'll work better that way. It's a better team. But I think it's interesting. The Lord was not really upset with this initial attempt, or the attempt by Oliver to translate. In Alma chapter 45, verse 22, there are 28 words in the handwriting of Joseph Smith. Now, why are those 28 words in there? Well, Oliver may have fallen asleep. Joseph finished out, took up the pen and finished the phrase or the translation of that text there. Oliver may have had to leave, do something, and Joseph finishes it. But I'm of the opinion that was possibly Oliver's attempt to try to translate the Book of Mormon. And the time frame fits pretty good. If they had begun in around April 7th and began with the Book of Mosiah, they very well could have been about 2/3 of the way through Alma. And these 28 words are the only writings of Joseph Smith in what we have of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. So I think we can't exclude the idea that this is possibly the passage Oliver actually translated, Joseph had to describe, and then he said, hey, let's go back to the original arrangement. But certainly we have to open that and leave that as a possibility, although Joseph may have just been finishing the sentence or finishing the phrase and trying to complete that at that moment. But you can't take away the idea that might have been Oliver's attempt. Sandwiched in between the translation revelations to Oliver, 6, 8, and 9, is section 7 of the Doctrine and Covenants today. And it's an interesting one. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but it certainly shows that Joseph and Oliver are having some interesting discussions about not only the translation of the Book of Mormon, I'm sure, but also the New Testament and other scriptural passages which they're raising between themselves. I don't know, maybe it was over dinner, maybe, we don't know, but it's interesting, of course, they are wondering what happened to the beloved Apostle John. And of course, if you read the last chapter of his gospel, it's kind of what happened. And we as Latter-day Saints know, of course, that John was translated and did not taste of death. Well, for Joseph and Oliver, they would not have had that kind of understanding. I think most historical tradition suggests John is buried or died in Ephesus, but they didn't know. And so this question arises, well, how can we find out? What's interesting is the heading to that revelation says, the revelation is a translated version of the record made on parchment by John and hidden up by himself. My gut thinking is that this is possible. Joseph Smith possibly saw in vision through the Urim and Thummim this parchment and translated that as what today is section 7. So this might have been a translated by Joseph Smith. Certainly the document's not in front of him, but he's seeing the document in visionary form, probably through the Urim and Thummim, and then provides this translation. This was electrifying to Oliver Cowdery, electrifying. And of course, years later, he uses the famous passage and phrase, these were days never to be forgotten. To sit under the voice of this seer, this individual who certainly he's seen his imperfections and his limitations. And for him to come forth with such a marvelous, coherent, descriptive story and doctrine and teachings as he understands it while looking over these plates and or translating these plates, I should say, through means of the Urim and Thummim or seer stone. He just cannot ever forget this marvelous moment, not moment, but period of time in his life when he saw revelation and experienced revelation, this type of revelation firsthand. It is so unusual. It is so unordinary, extraordinary. How many people have done what Joseph is doing? Not many. It's marvelous, and Oliver is just intrigued and fascinated by this experience. I think there's been a misconception in the church, and even among some scholars, concerning regarding the translation process. I think we can safely say that prior to the loss of the 116 pages, Joseph Smith used the Nephite interpreters, or the what he calls again a Urim and Thummim later, to do the translation of the Book of Mormon, the Nephite spectacles. After the loss of the 116 pages, Joseph Smith used primarily, and I think probably we could say exclusively, the seer stone. It did the same thing. It was much more convenient, and at this point in time, I think we can safely say he didn't have to have the plates in front of him. And I don't think that bothers Oliver Cowdery, because he still recognizes the translation is taking place, just a little bit different kind of vehicle. I'm sure Joseph had told him how he had used the Nephite spectacles or interpreters, but so some people might be bothered by the idea that at this point in time, Joseph probably doesn't even need the plates there. He can use that seer stone. He needs a little blockage of light, so he puts it in his hat, and the process basically is the same at that point in terms of the translation and how he will be able to dictate it. So I hope people are not disturbed by the idea that at this point in time, Joseph simplified the operation just a little bit by not having to put on the breastplate, attach the spectacles. Gosh darn it, the seer stone can do the very same thing in a kind of a less encumbersome way. During the course of the translation, Joseph and Oliver, of course, have many questions about what they're translating, the text, and so on and so forth. And we're told by Oliver Cowdery that they had just completed the translation of the Savior's ministry to the inhabitants of the Americas when some questions arose concerning baptism, probably authority to baptize, mode of baptism, so on and so forth. And of course, this led to their inquisition or desire to know more concerning baptism. And certainly the necessity illustrated in the Book of Mormon for the need to be baptized. So not only the need, but also, of course, the authority. And this certainly spawned Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to ask these types of questions. And they indicate that, of course, we only waited for the commandment to arise and be baptized. So now they know that something's probably going to happen here. They're going to receive some sort of authority to receive the priesthood, to be able to officially baptize, and of course they're going to be able to perform that ordinance between themselves. Again, fortunately, Joseph gives us the exact date, May 15th, 1829. They probably sought for this revelatory understanding by going north from Joseph's house there in Harmony into a portion of Joseph's property that would have been secluded and with trees, maple trees and so on. We believe that's probably where John the Baptist appeared and conferred the Aaronic priesthood, and we should say also Aaronic priesthood keys upon Joseph and Oliver. And then they would have made their way to the banks of the Susquehanna to perform the ordinances, or the ordinance of baptism. I think it's significant that Joseph Smith baptized Oliver first, and Oliver then baptized Joseph Smith. So Oliver certainly has the distinction of being the first person baptized in this dispensation, or in this period of Earth's history and the gospel, first person to be baptized. I think it's important to emphasize the keys of the priesthood as well. Some people would say, okay, what priesthood does Joseph and Oliver hold? Well, they hold the keys to the Aaronic priesthood, which keys are associated with the offices. And some people have said, okay, well, obviously they're priests in the Aaronic priesthood. No, we know as Latter-day Saints that there's 5 offices in the Aaronic priesthood: deacon, teacher, priest, bishop, and presiding bishop. Technically, I think we could say that upon receiving the ordination by John the Baptist, Joseph Smith and Oliver held the same keys that John the Baptist would have held, which keys today are housed or held by the presiding bishop of the church. This is a much more higher, if you could say, Aaronic priesthood office than I think we sometimes realize. And obviously Joseph and Oliver probably did not know that priesthood, all about that priesthood authority. But I think in hindsight we can say this is pretty significant. They're being ordained to what John the Baptist would have, the office or distinction or ordination John the Baptist held as a legal administrator in the days of Jesus Christ. He would have been, in a sense, the presiding high priest. We'll call him a presiding bishop today of the Aaronic order. I think it's significant that Oliver recorded this experience years later in the Messenger and Advocate. He recounts this experience of the visitation of John the Baptist, and he waxes quite eloquently. And this, I think we can safely say, this was his first time to receive and experience the divine heavenly messenger. And this is wonderful. And his expression is so much more powerful in some ways than Joseph Smith. And fortunately, of course, in the LDS edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Mormon, they include this passage at the end of the Joseph Smith's history there. And it's just a marvelous recounting by Oliver of seeing and experiencing this first-time experience of experiencing the presence of a divine being. It's absolutely electrifying to Oliver to see a heavenly personage. In late May 1829, because of the persecution mounting in the area of Harmony, Pennsylvania, and because Oliver has corresponded with David Whitmer, the decision was made to move the translation process up to the Whitmer home in Fayette, New York. And David Whitmer had made his way from Fayette and had come to Harmony for the express purpose of taking Joseph and Oliver back to Fayette. Again, according to David Whitmer, they arrived at his father's house, or Peter Whitmer Sr., around June 1, 1829. And this is where they pick up with the translation, again, of the Book of Mormon. I think things went pretty quickly there. We know that by about mid-month, the decision has been made and revelations given for the three witnesses to receive, for three men to receive a witness of the plates and Nephite artifacts. Today this is section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And they're even told in the Revelation that they will have to bear testimony of the things that they will both see and hear. And this is really, I think, quite a remarkable incident in early Mormonism, because here are these three men now closely associated with Joseph Smith, Oliver, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, will have the privilege of seeing the only relics left from the Nephite Lamanite civilization, and we could also say the Jaredite civilization. So this was a wonderful event in the lives of these three men. And of course, Oliver, it may appear and seem that he probably had not even seen the plates himself. If we look at some of the statements by other witnesses, it looks like Joseph Smith, of course, from after he had the opportunity to recommence translation with Oliver's scribe, Oliver and Joseph worked closely together, obviously, and he's right there during the translation process. But it looks like Joseph's using the seer stone and his hat, and the plates are concealed or covered, and so it looks like probably Oliver hasn't even had a chance to see the plates at this point in time. So this was a new thing for Oliver, as well as David Whitmer and Martin Harris. But it's a terrific event, certainly a key event in terms of prophetic fulfillment, and after this marvelous manifestation, Joseph Smith seemed so relieved. He came and reported that it just felt like a whole burden had been lifted from his shoulders, that now Oliver, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris also have to testify of the truthfulness of the work and of the Nephite artifacts and of the fact that Joseph Smith indeed had the plates. I think it's significant that the very next revelation that comes, which is today section 18 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer are both called in that revelation as apostles. Now, Heber C. Kimball later said that Martin Harris was also included in that group. Well, why would these three men be considered apostles? There's certainly no apostolic office, but the fact that these men have heard the voice of Jesus Christ in the manifestation of the plates and other Nephite artifacts certainly qualifies them to be special witnesses of Christ. And so I think it's significant that, again, that the Lord calls them, as he says, you are apostles, even like my ancient apostle Paul. So at this point in time, I think we can say Oliver and the other two, David and Whitmer and Martin Harris, are literally special witnesses of Jesus Christ, and hence the title or designation apostle, along, of course, with Joseph Smith. According to David Whitmer, the translation of the Book of Mormon was completed around July 1, 1829. So if you take into consideration the fact that they started on April 7th, that date we know, and the completion is around July 1, that's a period of less than 3 months, about 84 days, in which this translation process was ongoing. That's really a good clip. A much faster clip than when Martin Harris was assisting Joseph Smith in the translation the year previous. So Oliver's presence, Oliver's help, Oliver's acting as scribe really moved the work forward and the translation much more quickly than at any other time in the translation process. While translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith fully anticipated the time would come when they would need to search out a publisher for the manuscript. And I think it's significant that Oliver plays a major role in that endeavor as well. We know, of course, that he tried to secure a publisher. We know he went to Rochester and tried to secure the services of Thurlow Weed, who refused to have anything to do with it. Another individual is Elihu Marshall, and he was a little more accepting, but his price was high. But they had also talked previous to this with Egbert Bratt Grandin, or E.B. Grandin, in Palmyra. And Grandin had never published a book before, but he wanted to get in the book publishing business. There's good money to be had, and he felt he had the means and the manpower to be able to do it. But I think Grandin was fairly reluctant, just simply because of the controversy of the whole enterprise. But significantly, Joseph was able to work through Grandin's concerns, and with the help of Martin Harris, basically Grandin was guaranteed payment, and so a deal was struck in August of 1829. I believe it was August 25th. But to move that process forward with the publication of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith was not going to take any chances on any lost manuscript again. And so Oliver was put right to work in putting together and writing word for word, letter for letter, sentence for sentence, the entire manuscript of the Book of Mormon over again. And we call this the printer's copy, or it will be the copy that the printer will use as his text proof, I guess you'd say, to pull together the printing of the Book of Mormon at the Grandin print shop. I think it's significant to say that look who knows the Book of Mormon probably better than anybody, maybe even Joseph Smith included. No, I shouldn't say that, but Oliver, to have actually been the major scribe for the original manuscript, and then to be have actually been also the principal transcriber of the printer's copy, although we know Hiram probably did a few pages, and then there's another unknown scribe, possibly Martin Harris. But basically, the printer's copy is almost exclusively in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery. So he's had a major role in not only the translation, but of course the transcription of the printer's copy as they prepare now for the publication of the Book of Mormon. It's at this time that Oliver Cowdery also moves back to Palmyra, because I think Joseph doesn't want to go there. If he's there, there's controversy, there's opposition. And so he stays in Harmony, but he puts Oliver and Hiram Smith and Martin Harris in charge of the publication, overseeing the publication of the Book of Mormon. And it looks like Oliver actually moved in with the Smith family, Lucy and Joseph Smith Sr. and their family, so he could be in Palmyra and make a trip every day into town to oversee, along with Hiram and Martin, the publication process. It's interesting to note that it looks like Oliver even assisted in the publication effort or the printing effort, albeit limitedly, on a limited basis. Oliver is there, he's in the shop, he's seeing how this procedure is done, and he assists a little bit in that process. This begins, I think we can mark this as the beginning of Oliver Cowdery's printing experience, because he will be a major force in the printing operations of the church, both in Independence and also in Kirtland. But he got his start right there in the printing shop of E.B. Grandin as they were printing the Book of Mormon. We know that Oliver, of course, is corresponding with family members and keeping track of his experiences by telling people, and particularly telling his family members about his experiences. We know that for sure. It looks like some of the proof sheets of the Book of Mormon, maybe the rejects, maybe had a smear or something like that, that some individuals, of course, received these not so up to par copies. And we know that Oliver sent his brother, or his brother received, a couple of signatures of the Book of Mormon. So Oliver's working on his family members during this process to, I think, try to not only legitimize what he's doing, but to hope that they will eventually come around and participate in the events of the restoration. He wants to spread the good news, particularly among his family. But Warren seems to be the one that's going to be the most receptive, at least I think initially. And he lives in Freedom, New York, and he'll eventually join the church. And he's made actually the president of the Freedom branch there. He'll come to Kirtland and serve for a period of time in Kirtland leadership. But Oliver's working on his family, at least those living in the vicinity during this time as well. While the Book of Mormon was at the print shop and being prepared for publication, Joseph and Oliver are also moving forward with plans to eventually organize the church. And it looks like during this period of time that Joseph is composing and receiving understanding and revelatory understanding regarding just how to organize the church and its constitution, if you will, or bylaws. And during this time, he's preparing what will become the Articles and Covenants of the church, meaning what today is Section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants, in preparation for the organizational meeting of the church. I think we have to give credit to Oliver for his insight and contributions to that document. Although it bears the Joseph Smith's, basically, he's the main man here, but Oliver has some say. He does help in that transcription of that revelation. We'll call it a revelation because indeed it was, but it's a working document. They're working to put this thing together so that they can have this for the organizational meeting as kind of the foundational document for the church. I think we can safely say, though, that Oliver assists Joseph in the crafting and textual rendition of the Articles and Covenants of the church. It's interesting, after that, of course, was accepted by the church during actually was not accepted until the June 9th, 1830 meeting, but that following few months, Oliver writes back to Joseph and says, we really need to change a portion of the text, and Joseph, of course, would not bend on that, but Oliver was not beyond his input, giving his input and saying, this is the way I think it should be. Now, Joseph ultimately has the final say, but I think Oliver shows a very upfront kind of, I have a right to say something here as well. And indeed he did. I mean, he is the second elder. He's been in this game. He's been in the fight, so to speak. assisting Joseph, and he feels like he can share his opinions and his thoughts and his observations, his concerns, and yet at the same time, I think Joseph's going, okay, yeah, Oliver, I really respect you, but this is the way it is. So the buck stops here with Joseph, but Oliver is certainly not afraid to give input and initiate change where he felt was needed. But so he doesn't. Oliver's a tough-minded guy, and he's very opinionated. But that's not to say that's a negative necessarily. He just feels like he has a right to say something and to contribute where he feels it's necessary. In September of 1830, we have kind of the first little bit of controversy in the church regarding who's really in charge. And this involves the situation with Hiram Page there in the Fayette, New York area, where Hiram has been claiming he is receiving revelations for the church. What's kind of interesting here is Oliver kind of gets sucked into this. And he's clearly thinking Page is okay with his revelation. This is interesting. This is good stuff. Oliver believes him. And this causes some problems and results in the receipt by Joseph Smith of Section 28 of the Doctrine and Covenants, whereas Oliver is basically set in place here. And Joseph is truly grateful that this revelation has come, because he has to make it very clear that he is the one sole person entitled to receive revelation for the church. And the revelation is very direct, Oliver. You cannot command him who's at your head. And that's Joseph Smith. So we have a little bit of this controversy going on. At the same time, it's interesting that in the revelation, Oliver's charged to straighten out Hiram Page, not Joseph Smith. So I think that's interesting. Joseph is more than willing, or he sees the need for Oliver to be the one to make the corrections here, not him. Here's what the revelation says. Now you stick to it and follow through here, and hope you learn your lesson. At the same time, it's an interesting scenario. We learn that Oliver, of course, is also called on at this time in the Revelation to go on a mission to the Lamanites. Well, a Lamanite in 1830 meant North American Indian, and in May of 1830, just a few months earlier, Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, had signed the Indian Removal Act, calling for all uncivilized tribes to remove to the area west of Missouri, this newfound Indian territory. So in the minds of Oliver and others who are probably wondering, okay, mission to Lamanites, where does that? Well, that's pretty clear. You've got to go 1,400 miles. We're going to go all the way to Missouri, west of Missouri. So this is the first appointed, you might say, long-term mission appointed in the church. And Oliver's the man to head it up. He is the right guy, there's no question about it. He's single. He's a little more free to go. Joseph has to manage and operate the church in Fayette and Manchester, Palmyra, and also down there in Colesville. But we could send Oliver. And so this is Oliver's first call in terms of a missionary assignment. A short time after Section 28 was received, Parley P. Pratt, this new Mormon convert, recognizes, hey, this might be a wonderful opportunity for him to also be called to some sort of mission assignment. And sure enough, Joseph Smith received Section 30, calling Parley P. Pratt to go on this mission. And then Parley needs a companion, so another individual is mentioned. We kind of wonder how he might pronounce his name, Ziba, or Ziba Peterson. There's good evidence his first name was Richard, but so why he went by that, we don't know. But nonetheless, this makes the foursome complete now of the four men who are going to go on this extended mission assignment to all the way to the frontier of the United States, the extreme western border. They're just opposite of the state of Missouri. They're going to leave in October. We know they left around October 17th. They had a few weeks of preparation and to get things put together, and then they'll make their way to make their way to the west. But they will be gone, or they will be kind of out of touch with Joseph Smith, if you will, They'll be gone from October of 1830, and Joseph will not meet up with them again until July of 1831, when he meets them in the Independence area. So this is the first real extended mission of the church, and of course this mission will change the entire dynamics of the church in terms of where they're now going to be centered and some of the major new contributors as we convert a number of people in Ohio because of the result of this missionary effort by these 4 missionaries to the Lamanites. I think it's significant that Oliver Cowdery is the person who ordains Joseph Smith to the apostleship. Now we know that according to their record, that after they received the Melchizedek priesthood, they were to defer their ordination, or their earthly ordination, if you will, to their respective priesthood offices or callings until the organizational meeting. And in the Revelations, it says that Oliver was to be appointed the second elder and Joseph to be the first elder. Well, who's going to ordain Joseph Smith? Well, it's Oliver Cowdery. After all, he held the keys, Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood keys, along with Joseph Smith, so he had not only every right, but every priesthood key necessary to do that. So I think it's significant. Oliver Cowdery ordains Joseph Smith. That's pretty powerful. It shows again the great trust and the great expectation, maybe too, as well, that the Lord has placed upon Oliver Cowdery in terms of the early events of the Restoration to really get this thing going and do it with proper authority. Oliver gets to do it, and that's significant. I think the significance of Oliver Cowdery's contributions is also exemplified in the fact that so many of the early revelations he's involved in, directly or indirectly. For example, there are 4 revelations in our present Doctrine and Covenants in which were directed to him. Section 6, Section 8, Section 9, and Section 28. All of those are addressed directly to Oliver Cowdery. In addition, there's a number of revelations, 5 in fact, addressed or directed to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery together. And or they received that revelation together. So there's 9. There's 4 revelations that Joseph or Oliver's mentioned in connection with other individuals, such as David Whitmer, Martin Harris, the witnesses. And then Oliver Cowdery is also, we can say, a contributor to Section 20, and also he helped write what is today Section 134. So his imprint in the Revelations is all over. His imprint or footprint, whatever you want to call it, he's there. And then in another 16 Revelations, he's mentioned by name. So you just can't get past the fact that, again, Oliver is a major, major player and is relied upon or instructed in Revelation in terms of his assistance that he needs to give to Joseph Smith. So I think we just have to recognize, again, this is one valuable, important individual in the early Restoration. I just can't think of anyone playing a more significant role in terms of the early events of the Restoration than Oliver Cowdery, and especially in terms of the Revelations. Nobody else comes close in terms of receipts or revelations directed to them, that kind of thing. So Oliver's really clearly the number 2 guy in the revelations received by Joseph Smith. Of course, it's significant that the missionaries, the Lamanites, do a layover in Kirtland, and that was, of course, instigated by the fact that Parley P. Pratt knew many of the key individuals that will join the church, most significant being Sidney Rigdon. But after the missionaries and Lamanites meet with Rigdon, of course, he's a little bit skeptical of the message, at the same time very inquisitive. I think it's important to note, though, that it was Oliver's testimony to Sidney Rigdon that really got him hook, line, and sinker. When Oliver Cowdery tells and testifies to Sidney Rigdon that Peter, James, and John laid their hands on my head, I think that was a key turning point in the conversion of Sidney Rigdon, to think that this Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, who he's not met, have legitimate priesthood authority. I think that's something Sidney Rigdon was really looking for in terms of proper authority, which of course the disciples of Christ would not claim. So I think it's the Book of Mormon, the message of the Book of Mormon, and Oliver's testimony concerning the divine authority they received under the hands of Peter, James, and John that convinced and helped in the solidification of the testimony of Sidney Rigdon and his desire to then be united with the church. And not surprisingly, Oliver Cowdery is the one who baptizes Sidney Rigdon. It's important, I think, also to note that Section 21 calls Oliver to be the first preacher in the church or unto the church or to the church. Why would he be called as the preacher? Well, I think Oliver, as we know from his experiences and others' experiences with him, he was a pretty good orator. This man could make a statement. And Joseph and the Lord recognized this man has a powerful, powerful gift of testimony and expression. I would like to have heard him preach. And I think it's interesting that really during the period of 1830 to 38, Joseph lets a lot of other people do the preaching. He's the revelator. We'll let Rigdon, Hyde, and Oliver Cowdery and others do the preaching. And I think that just demonstrates again that Oliver has some real skills as a preacher of righteousness, hence his title, First Preacher Unto the Church. It was in Kirtland that these 4 missionaries to the Lamanites also received help and willingness from Frederick G. Williams, a new convert who will play a major role in the early restoration events of the church. And Williams joined the church, is baptized, and agrees and wants to go with these 4 missionaries to the Lamanites to Missouri and be one of their companions. So we pick up a convert, and they leave again probably sometime in November. And during this time, during the next approximately 2 months, they'll make their way down the Ohio River at what is today Cairo, Illinois. The mouth of the Ohio, they encountered the Mississippi, but it was frozen over. So they basically had to go by foot up to St. Louis. And then at St. Louis, they should have met with William Clark, the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the government. There is a good evidence he was probably in Washington, D.C., but they should have contacted someone in regards to getting permission to preach to the Indians in Indian Territory, but they did not. Nonetheless, they made their way across the Boonslick Trail and made their way to Independence, where they arrived on January 13th, 1831, dead of winter. They were probably more skeleton than anything. That was a very, very harsh winter, very difficult conditions to travel and walk. While in Independence, Peter Whitmer Jr. and Ziba Peterson established a tailor shop. They got employment to try to, of course, fund the rest of their companions. And Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer Jr., and Frederick G. Williams went across the line dividing Missouri from Indian Territory. They spent one evening or a few days, whatever, in a couple of days with the Shawnee, at the Shawnee Indian Mission there, recognizing that the Methodists were already there preaching to the Indians, that tribe. They felt the necessity to move somewhere else, and located just a few miles north and west of the Shawnee Mission was the tribal village of the Delaware Indians, who had just arrived there a few months earlier. We know that they had some success there, and that Oliver Cowdery preached a wonderful sermon recorded by Parley P. Pratt about the Book of Mormon and the forefathers of these Indian tribes. And I think, again, Parley P. Pratt was very impressed with Oliver's preaching and his declaration of the Book of Mormon. Unfortunately, of course, they had not received permission to be there, and word reached some of the Indian agents, particularly a man by the name of Richard Cummins. And this Cummins had no clue who these men were, who are Mormons. They'd never heard of this religious sect. So he checks it out, recognizes they have no papers, and basically orders these men off Indian territory. I think they didn't worry about it too much at that point in time, and didn't move too quickly, forcing Cummins to come back. And he threatened them that if they did not leave, that he would arrest them and put them in the stockade up in Fort Leavenworth. So these three Mormon missionaries, Cowdery at their head, were forced to go back to Independence now, where they now will have to report to Joseph Smith that we've got problems. We haven't been able to do what we anticipated in terms of preaching the gospel to the Indians. And so Parley P. Pratt is going to be sent back. He was thinking at the time all the way to New York, but he made his way back, of course, made his way to Kirtland, and by that time Joseph Smith has already moved with and the main body of the church is moving to Kirtland, and there Parley reports on the mission to the Lamanites. Oliver Cowdery remained in Independence and was there when Joseph Smith and a company of elders came during the summer of 1831. They arrived about mid-July, and so it's been several months. They left in October, and now Joseph Smith is finally meeting up with his friend and fellow elder Oliver Cowdery, and here Joseph Smith is going to do basically three things. They dedicate the land of Zion. In fact, Sidney Rigdon does that in Caw Township on August 2nd. On August 3rd, Joseph Smith dedicated the site for the temple, and Oliver Cowdery was there. He was present at the dedication of the temple site in Independence, or just outside Independence at the time. And then on the 4th of August, Joseph Smith and the church held a conference, which they were commanded to by Revelation in section 52. So the July meeting of Joseph Smith and these elders really reunites Joseph Smith with his good friend Oliver Cowdery. Significant that Oliver Cowdery, of course, during the initial Kirtland years, Oliver's not there. He's down in Missouri, and he's living in Independence. And when W.W. Phelps is called by Revelation to go to Independence, he's called to establish himself there and to set up the printing operations for the church. And this was done in, again, Independence, where they purchased a press and had it shipped to Independence. And beginning in 32, middle of 32, June of 32, W.W. Phelps starts printing the church's first newspaper, the Evening and Morning Star. And it's at this time that Oliver Cowdery is basically an assistant to W.W. Phelps, and he's assisting in this printing operation. At the same time, they're printing the Evening and Morning Star. They're also printing the what is today we know as the 1833 doctrine. At the same time they're printing the Evening and the Morning Star, they're also setting the type and preparing the galleys for the what we now know today as the 1833 Book of Commandments. So Oliver's work and assignment in 1832-33 is really as a printer. And again, he had some experience from the printing of the Book of Mormon, but this is where he really learns a lot from Phelps and learns how to really become a very skilled and an excellent printer. While Oliver's living in Independence, he also finally gets married. The date is December 18th, 1832, and he marries Elizabeth Ann Whitmer, the youngest daughter of Peter Whitmer Sr., and Parley P. Pratt performed the ceremony. So this would have made Oliver, about 27, and his bride, Elizabeth Ann Whitmer, was just a month shy of turning 18. So we don't know when he began having feelings for her, but obviously, again, he's been closely connected with the Whitmer family. But now she's of age, and Oliver marries her. The marriage of Oliver Cowdery to Elizabeth Ann Whitmer really solidifies now the relationship that Oliver's obviously developed over the course of a couple of years at least with the Whitmer family. Now, of course, he's the son-in-law and brother-in-law to these other major players in the Restoration. Oliver and his wife Elizabeth Ann had several children. However, only one daughter lived to maturity. That daughter, unfortunately, did not have any children, so there are no posterity after that one daughter, and hence the Cowdery line ends. Following the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from Jackson County in late October, early November 1834, Oliver Cowdery makes his way back to Kirtland. And for the next several years, he'll basically be in the Kirtland area. And he, again, plays a major role in the events of the church in Kirtland. One of the most significant roles I think we need to acknowledge him doing is because now he's had some experience with printing, he is actually appointed to be the editor of the Messenger and Advocate, or Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, this second newspaper, if you will, this newspaper now being printed by the church in Kirtland. He actually has 2 stints as editor of the Messenger and Advocate. The first one being October 1834 he's appointed, and he serves until May of 1835. And again, he picks this up as an editor again in April of 1836, continuing through January of 1837. So as far as an editorial voice and serving as this editor, he plays a major role in the dissemination of church doctrine, of letters, of history, so on, as this editor. So he's a real mover and shaker in regards to what is going to be read by the saints and adopted by the saints and understood by the saints concerning their theology and their doctrine and their teachings and their history. So I think it's significant that, again, he's playing right into that role, which now he's, I think, been prepared for by his past experiences as editor or helping W.W. Phelps with the newspaper and the Book of Commandments in Independence, and then, of course, his previous work with the publication of the Book of Mormon. It's during the Kirtland period that Oliver is also appointed a member of the High Council in Kirtland. And this was received in February of 1834. So now he's serving as second elder and a high counselor in the Kirtland stake. At the same time, Joseph has now organized the first presidency, basically consisting of Joseph himself, Sidney Rigdon, and this Kirtland convert, Frederick G. Williams. I'm not sure, but I think we can say that in a way, Oliver might felt a little bad about that. I think we need to say that he really is the number 2 guy here, but Sidney Rigdon's kind of becoming a more prominent figure. Now, I'm not sure if that played into this, but the interesting thing is on December 5th, 1834, Joseph Smith appoints or ordains Oliver Cowdery assistant president of the church, and to hold the keys and priesthood authority equal, if you will, to that of Joseph Smith. So I think there was a sense or a need by 1834 to kind of reinstate, I think that might be the word, Oliver in terms of his official title and position in the church as kind of that, again, that second elder only to Joseph Smith. So I think that's a very, very important, prominent and important role and position that Oliver now has officially been designated and set apart and appointed to as assistant president of the church. I think it's important to understand that he held that until his excommunication in April of 1838. And then even maybe to tack on to that, the fact that in 1841, Section 124, Hiram Smith is appointed to take the place of Oliver Cowdery in that position as assistant president of the church. So this is a very, very important ordination and calling, now really bringing Oliver Cowdery to the status that he should have had and really indeed was entitled to from very early on. On April 3rd, 1836, just a week after the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, most Latter-day Saints are familiar with the fact that on that occasion, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were present when the Savior appeared just to them there in the west end, or the Melchizedek priesthood pulpit section of the Kirtland Temple. And there, of course, they were entitled to this beautiful manifestation of the Savior, in which he accepts the temple and, of course, acknowledges the efforts and labors of the saints to build this beautiful and costly structure in their poverty. But following the Savior's appearance, Joseph and Oliver received the keys from these divine messengers, Moses, Elias, and Elijah. Again, why is Oliver there? Well, he's the second elder. He is the one who receives those keys along with Joseph Smith at every point. With John the Baptist, 1829, Peter, James, and John, Melchizedek priesthood. Now they receive the final priesthood keys, if you will. And Oliver is certainly entitled to those because of his appointment as assistant president of the church and as the second witness of the restoration. In 1836, the church began to explore some economic investments and enterprises. And Oliver Cowdery's right in the thick of this as well. They organized what is called the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, basically a joint stock company because it wasn't a legitimate bank. But nonetheless, Oliver becomes involved in this, heavily involved in this, and became one of the bank's directors. In the meantime, he also went to Monroe, Michigan, in his capacity as a director of the Kirtland Bank, if you will, and negotiates the purchase of the controlling interest of the Bank of Monroe, Michigan. Of course, there's going to be a number of things associated with this economic adventure that did not prove too prosperous or fruitful. But nonetheless, Oliver's heavily involved in that and playing a leading role in that bank's operation or in that institution's operation. And unfortunately, of course, also it was not ultimately successful. And Oliver's going to take some of the heat for that as well. Oliver actually served for a period of time as the president of the Monroe Bank. But again, it's closely tied to the Kirtland Bank operated by the church and the church leaders. It's interesting to note that also in Kirtland, Oliver Cowdery is elected Justice of the Peace by a large margin. There was like 211 to 2. Although his time as a Justice of the Peace was not long, only about 4 months, he did hear a number of cases. And I think this kind of gets Oliver's juices flowing a little bit for his love and desire for and hope that he might be able to understand and practice law. I think he gets his feet wet a little bit here, and I think he recognized he has some abilities that could probably help him to become a very successful lawyer. And this plays out a little bit later, but I think we cannot mention the fact that during the Kirtland period, late Kirtland period, 1837, Oliver gets his first taste of the law profession.